When you want to summarize a story or tell someone what's going on, one of the easiest ways to do it is to give a summary or an outline of what happens. There's a hobbit named Frodo, and he needs to destroy a ring in a mountain, so he sets off with some friends to do it. There's a young girl who needs to fight for her life in the Hunger Games. But how do we do this for the entire Gospel of Matthew? For hundreds of years, scholars have been debating the best way to outline the Gospel of Matthew. Now, before you figure out how you're going to outline it, you first have to answer some initial questions. 1. What is Matthew highlighting to his readers? What does he think is important? 2. What are the major turning points in the story? Where does everything change? And 3. Why is Matthew writing? What is Matthew really trying to get at? What is Matthew really trying to get at? Now, there are a lot of great outlines for the Gospel of Matthew, but today I want to go over two of my favorite that I've found to be really helpful when examining the Gospel. The first theory follows Jesus' 5 discourses found throughout the Gospel of Matthew. It starts with the Sermon on the Mount in chapter 5, followed by his instructions to his disciples in chapter 10. Third is when he's speaking to his disciples in chapter 13. Fourth is when he's answering his disciples' questions in chapter 18. And finally, the last stretch is when Jesus gives his discourses on the destruction of the temple in the end times in chapters 24 and 25. So what does this interpretation believe that Matthew is trying to highlight? 1. He's writing about Jesus' teachings, and perhaps he's using the 5 sections to mimic the Torah. What are the major turning points? 2. This outline would argue that after Jesus gives a discourse or goes on a speech about what he's teaching his disciples, the next section of the text narrates exactly that. And finally, why is Matthew writing? Matthew is writing to tell the story of Jesus' teachings and how he fulfilled them in his death and resurrection. So when you're reading the Gospel of Matthew in this outline, and you get to a point where Jesus is giving one of those big texts of teaching, take a moment to stop, reflect on it, and think about how in the next chapters you're going to read this is demonstrated. Another possible outline of Matthew is the narrative or storytelling outline. This outline starts by identifying the person of Jesus in chapters 1 to 4 verse 16. Then it shifts to the proclamation and ministry of Jesus to Israel in chapters 4:17 to chapter 16 verse 20. And then it ends with Jesus' suffering, death, and resurrection, not only for Israel, but for all nations, in chapter 16, verse 21, to the end. When you're looking at this outline, you should realize that, 1. Matthew is trying to highlight the rule and reign of Jesus Christ and what it looks like for us. 2. The major turning points are when The major turning points is when you come across the phrase, from that time on, because after that phrase, things start to change. And 3, Matthew is writing to give us an inside view on the compassion of Jesus' rule and reign. This is demonstrated all throughout Jesus' life in the Gospel of Matthew, and is brought to its complete fulfillment in his death and resurrection for his people. This is demonstrated all throughout Jesus' life in the Gospel of Matthew, and is brought to its complete fulfillment in his death and resurrection for his people. So when you're reading through Matthew with this outline in mind, after you read a chapter or so, stop and ask yourself, what does this tell me about Jesus? I hope that helps shed some light on possible outlines for Matthew. If you have any questions or comments, please leave them below. Thanks for watching.